A Heroine's Beginning, Chapter 4. The first year of my employment at the manor house was fairly uneventful. I was awoken every morning by Jane, and we worked at our tasks all day, retiring to bed late at night. Jane and I began to form a close friendship, but after all the time we spent together, it was hardly surprising. My ability to scrub and clean improved, and I found myself with more free time. Mrs. Pole couldn't allow that, and set me to work doing other tasks. Once she discovered my needlework was commendable, she decided I could assist Jane in stitching and mending clothes. I had only ever learned how to stitch my name into the back of my clothes, never actually mending anything before. But Jane was a patient teacher, and it was not long before I could adjust a dress to fit the ever-growing Miss Ella, and could add embroidery to tablecloths and napkins and such. I found I enjoyed stitching. The rhythmic piercing of the fabric, and watching the pattern take shape, I discovered could be very soothing and fulfilling. Miss Ella had continued to be more kind to me, and was always lending me books, which I finally got the energy to read. After Utopia, she lent me storybooks that thrilled and excited me. I especially loved the Tales of Robin Hood, which I had seen Ella reading on my first day. She smiled as she handed it to me, as if she knew something I didn't. She insisted that I would love it immensely, and may especially find one character interesting. As I read it, I was transported to a time long ago, where a young man with a strong sense of justice returns home to find corrupt and evil people ruling the land. When he is outlawed for doing the right thing, he resolves to use his life to bring the wronged people of the nation some happiness. He robs the greedy and unjust nobility to give to the poor, to help them feed themselves. He is also madly in love with a certain maid Marion. My heart stopped when I read this part of the book. Maid Marion was strong and fiercely independent. She also stood up for what was right, but played the game of politics to get justice. She also loved Robin with all of her heart, but this would never stop her from doing her utmost to help the righteous cause, even if that meant that she and Robin could never be seen together or married. Her passion for life and helping others made it easier to bear the pain of being separated from him. To the nobility of the land, she was a beautiful, confident young woman who could be a little outspoken, but was generally liked amongst them. There were other suitors vying for her hand in marriage, but she turned them all away, and even when some jealous, rejected men tried to disrupt her happiness, she always found a way to best them. Reading this book for the first time was like looking through a mirror, not to see your own reflection, but to see a version of you that you aspire to be, like looking at the possibility of you. That's how I felt reading about Marion and Robin's exploits. I aspired to be exactly like her, brave and courageous, even in a world where women were meant to be demure and feeble. It also helped that we practically shared the same name. Marion's character and story had captured my imagination, and I would never forget it. I borrowed that book many times over the year, and each time I read it, I consciously made an effort to alter my own behavior to be more like Marion. I was now comfortable enough in my situation to talk to the other members of staff like I had known them all my life. I was no longer the shy little girl who was paranoid about making mistakes in front of everyone. I had become a bit of a chatterbox again, and was always singing or mumbling something while I worked. Even at night, I had been awoken by Jane hitting me with a pillow for mumbling in my sleep. She really was like an older sister to me now. We would stay up late talking for hours. I would tell her stories that I had read, as she had never learned to read. She much preferred the romantic stories to the adventure ones. Jane would speak to me about her life, her interests, and any gossip she heard from the village. But most of all, Jane liked to talk about her beau, the baker's son from the village named Michael. They had been childhood sweethearts, and he takes every opportunity he can to come visit her here at the manor. He was always the one to deliver the morning bread, and Jane was always the one to greet him by the door. I had seen them a few times, if I were walking down the hallway and saw them out of the window by the back door. Jane had a certain smile that she only ever wore on her face when Michael was around, and Michael had a sort of goofy grin he would only make when he saw her or when her name was mentioned. I may have only been young, but when I saw them together, I knew it was the sort of love that I had read about in stories. One time, I asked Jane if she and Michael were betrothed, and she replied they were not, but that there was a sort of understanding between them, that if the question did arise, there would be no doubt of the answer. Miss Ella had not changed much over the year. If anything, she grew more kind and compassionate. She would often sneak down to the kitchen to steal food or speak to me about the newest book I had borrowed. We would sit at the kitchen table for what seemed like an age, with me continuing to sew, and Miss Ella sat with a cup of tea, debating the validity of the ideas of a utopian society. We would talk about this character or that from different novels, and I would frequently speak out against the evil characters, about what awful people they were, whereas Ella always took a different approach, and tried to humanize them, claiming we did not know the circumstances of their lives, or the actions that led them to be unkind. However, there was one character on which our viewpoints were switched, Sir Guy of Gisborne, a complex character from the tales of Robin Hood. He falls in love with Maid Marion, and tries to win her heart on many occasions, but there is always the matter of the sheriff. He is very loyal to him, and many times his two duties, to his lord and to his heart, are contradictory, and he normally chooses his lord. Ella cannot justify this, as she believes love and the duty to your heart should win out over all others. I, however, can see why he frequently chooses to obey his superior. No one is ever perfect, and the way the world works means you cannot always have the luxury of choosing your heart every time. We playfully argued over this point for some time. Mrs. Pole, on the other hand, does not like the idea of wasting time in her kitchen, and so decrees if Miss Ella voluntarily enters the kitchen, then she can voluntarily work as well. When Ella protests, Mrs. Pole only argues that doing chores and learning these things are an essential part of anyone's life, and you never know when they could come in handy. From then on, when Ella came to visit me, she would help out in the kitchen, learning how to cook and bake. She was really quite proud of her efforts, and would often serve her parents her own creations. I believe she actually quite liked being put to work. As she no longer had a governess, there really wasn't much to do around the house, other than sit, read, draw, or play the pianoforte. There was no useful occupation for a young lady. Her mother would oversee the running of the house, handling accounts and so forth. She'd go to visit friends and participate in society. Ella, however, was not yet 18, and so was too young to go. I only ever really met Lady Eleanor once, a year into my new life. I was walking along the hallway, going to clean the fireplaces in the master bedroom one afternoon. Sir Henry was away on business, and Lady Eleanor was in the study, completing some tasks, I know not what. I was not feeling very well that day. All morning I had felt flushed and a little off, and I had a slight headache, but was not so ill that I couldn't work. I sat down the bucket and brush next to the fireplace, and knelt down to begin scrubbing away the dirt and soot. I was there for about half an hour, and my mood had not really improved. My stomach went all tight, and I was forced to bend forward, clutching my belly. I cried out in pain, unaware of what was happening. I had never experienced this before. Then the door opened, and Lady Eleanor walked in to find me curled up on the floor, holding myself in pain. She ran over to me and asked what was wrong. "I don't know," I told her. "I just heard around here," I said, signaling to my belly. She pulled me up and placed me in a chair by the window. She then hurried and reached for a wooden box that she kept on the shelf next to her bed. Inside there were a lot of old rags and a bag of herbs. She looked at me kindly. "Are you bleeding?" she asked. I was very confused. My face must have shown this, as she explained if I was bleeding down there, pointing to below my belly. She told me there was nothing to be alarmed about, but that I should check. She turned away from me and said she would be back in a minute, leaving the room. I pulled up my skirts, and to my horror I saw blood staining them. I started panicking, unsure what to do. I pushed my skirts back down when I heard footsteps outside the door, and Lady Eleanor returned with a cup of tea. She gently sat it down on the table next to me, and began explaining this was a completely normal thing to happen, and the pain would go away as I drank the tea. I slowly picked up the cup and saw that it was not normal tea, but an herbal brew, containing something I did not recognize. I began to sip it, and she smiled at me again. By the time I had finished it, she had pulled the rope in the room, signaling for a servant to come. Lady Eleanor told me that this is what happens to all women, and it occurs once a month, and it meant that I could now have children. Mrs. Pole arrived, and Lady Eleanor explained to her that my courses had come, and I needed some old rags, and maybe even a bath. Mrs. Pole gestured for me to stand and follow her, and as I walked past Lady Eleanor, I thanked her for her kindness. She responded that it was no trouble at all, especially for someone who was a friend to her daughter. I was startled at this. I didn't even think she knew my name, or who I was, let alone if I was a friend to Miss Ella. I could now see why Miss Ella was so kind and compassionate, with someone like Lady Eleanor for a mother. I smiled at her as I left the room. Mrs. Pole gave me the rest of the day off, and even ran me a bath, a pure luxury. I normally had to make do with washing myself in the basin, or occasionally in the cold water outside. I sat for what seemed like hours in the warm water. I never knew washing could actually be a joy rather than a chore. My muscles loosened, and even with the slight ache in my abdomen, I felt relaxed. Mrs. Pole had also snuck in some oils, and I now smelled like lavender. I now understood why high-born people have baths so often, and I decided that if I were ever in a position of money where I could have a bath, I would do so without hesitation. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Lady Eleanor, how kind she was. Most mistresses would not have done such a thing for a scullery maid. They would have ignored her and told her to go back to work. I liked her very much, and I knew how well respected she was amongst the staff. Her husband and daughter adored her. I could frequently hear the sounds of laughter drifting its way from the room the family occupied. The master and mistress never slept separately, and I had never heard them raise voices to each other. They had a truly blessed life, and I thought I should like to have a similar one, a life that is shared with the people you love, and who love you in return. Of course, a little adventure and intrigue along the way wouldn't hurt, would it?